I learned I was not welcome from a piece of paper taped to a wall that had never done anything to deserve such cruelty. It was already evening. I remember that because the sky had begun to dim and the city lights were coming on one by one, as if nothing unusual was happening anywhere. I stood still longer than I should have, reading the same sentence again and again, my eyes tracing each word slowly, as if changing the order might soften their meaning. My son had banned me. Not quietly, not privately. He had made sure there was no confusion, and beside my name, written with the same finality, was the name of the man I married 2 years ago, my husband. The man my son never learned how to look at without resentment. I did not cry. That surprised me. I had imagined that if something like this ever happened, my chest would tighten, my breath would catch, my knees might weaken. None of that happened. What I felt instead was a hollow stillness, as if the sound inside me had been turned off. I folded the paper carefully, even though there was no reason to keep it, and slipped it into my purse. Old habits die slowly. You learn to tidy pain when you have carried it for decades. My husband stood beside me, silent. He did not ask what it said. He did not need to. He has always known how to read my face, even when I try to keep it calm. We stood there together for a few seconds longer than necessary. Two people paused in a place where they were no longer wanted. Then I took a step back. He followed, and we walked away. Before leaving, we placed the gift box on the small table near the entrance, among dozens of others wrapped in expensive paper and tied with ribbons that cost more than my weekly groceries. Ours was plain, brown paper, no name written on top, nothing to draw attention. I set it down gently, as if it were fragile, though it was not. Then we left the building and returned to the car, the door closing behind us with a quiet, unremarkable sound. At that moment, no one noticed. That would change later. Several hours after we got home, while the party was still unfolding without us, my phone began to vibrate on the table. A message, then another, then a call I did not answer. Someone had sent a video. I did not open it right away. I made tea first. I sat down. Only then did I press play. What I saw on that small screen would spread through the room where I was not allowed to stand, and in that moment, everything my son had worked so carefully to protect began to crack. But to explain what was inside that box and why it mattered, I need to go back to the hours before any of this happened, before the paper on the wall, before the silence, before I understood how far my son was willing to go to erase me. Earlier that afternoon, I had stood in front of my bedroom mirror fastening a necklace I had owned for more than 30 years. It was simple, nothing impressive, but it had survived many versions of me. I wore it because it felt familiar. My husband sat on the edge of the bed, tying his shoes slowly, carefully, as if he were preparing for something important, even though he pretended it wasn't. He asked me if I was ready. I said yes, even though my stomach felt unsettled in a way I could not explain. The invitation had come 2 weeks earlier, formal, polite, addressed only to me, not to us. I noticed that immediately. I noticed everything when it came to my son. He had always been precise with his words, even as a child. When I asked him whether my husband was welcome, there was a pause on the phone, just long enough. Then he said it would be better if I came alone. He said it casually, as if he were discussing the weather. I told him I wouldn't be coming alone. He said nothing after that. The invitation was never withdrawn, but nothing more was said either. Silence has many meanings. I chose to believe the kindest one. That was my mistake. My son's party was being held in one of the most fashionable venues in the city. I had never been inside before. As we approached, I could see guests arriving in clusters, laughing, greeting each other with easy familiarity. Everyone looked like they belonged. We parked farther away than most, not because we had to, but because my husband prefers not to take up space where he feels unwelcome. He has lived his life quietly, building things with his hands, fixing what others throw away. He has never needed applause. As we walked toward the entrance, I felt something I had not felt in years. Not excitement, not fear, anticipation mixed with unease. This was my son, the boy I raised alone after his father died, the child whose shoes I mended, whose lunches I packed, whose dreams I listened to at night when he could not sleep. I had attended every milestone, I celebrated every success. I told myself this was just another moment. I told myself there was still a place for me. That illusion lasted until I saw the notice. I did not argue. I did not knock. I did not call him. I simply stood there absorbing the message meant for me while people passed by without looking twice. No one intervened. No one questioned it. Why would they? To them, I was just an older woman standing too still in the wrong place. On the drive home, my husband reached for my hand. His thumb brushed against my knuckles, slow and steady. He did not tell me it would be all right. He did not tell me my son was wrong. He let the silence exist, which was the kindest thing he could have done. That silence followed us into the house, into the kitchen, into the evening. And somewhere across the city, my son was lifting a glass, smiling for photographs, unaware that the quiet choice I made at the door would soon return to him in a way he could not ignore.
That night stretched longer than it needed to. Time has a way of slowing down when you are no longer expected anywhere. After I finished my tea, I washed the cup carefully, even though it was already clean, and placed it back in the cabinet. My husband sat at the small table, his hands folded, his gaze fixed on nothing in particular. The house felt quieter than usual, not empty, but hushed, as if it were listening with us. Outside, a neighbor's television flickered through the curtains, bursts of laughter from a show neither of us was watching. Somewhere across the city, my son's name was being spoken warmly, glasses were being raised, and his life was continuing without interruption. I did not check my phone again that night. I knew messages would come. Curiosity tugged at me, but I had lived long enough to understand that some moments need distance before they can be faced. Instead, I went to bed early. Sleep came in fragments. I would drift off, then wake again, my mind circling the same quiet thought. Not anger, not shock, just a slow, heavy recognition settling into place. This was not an accident. This had been chosen. In the morning, sunlight slipped through the curtains, pale and unremarkable. My husband was already awake, moving gently through the kitchen, careful not to disturb me. The smell of toast reached the bedroom before he did. When I joined him, he asked how I was feeling. I told him the truth. I said I felt older than I had the day before. He nodded, as if that made sense. He poured me coffee and slid the cup toward me without comment. By midday, the messages had piled up. Friends I hadn't spoken to in years, a distant cousin, even someone I barely recognized from my son's circle. Their words were cautious, uneven, as if they were unsure how much I already knew. I read them slowly. I did not respond. There was a pattern to what they said, even when the details differed. Something had happened at the party, something unexpected, something that had unsettled the room. No one explained what it was. No one dared to. In the afternoon, my son finally called. I watched the phone ring until it stopped. He called again an hour later. I let that ring too. It was not a punishment, it was self-preservation. I needed to hear my own thoughts before I heard his voice. That evening, when the house had settled again and the day had worn itself thin, I listened to the voicemail he left. His words came quickly, without their usual polish. He asked where I was. He asked why I had left the gift. He asked what I was trying to do. There was no apology. There was confusion, sharp-edged and defensive. I did not call him back. The days that followed were strange in their normality. Laundry still needed folding, meals still needed cooking, my husband still went to work each morning, returning with sawdust on his sleeves and quiet stories about projects he was finishing. Life did not pause just because something inside me had shifted. And yet, beneath every ordinary task, there was a growing awareness that a door had closed and another was slowly opening, though I could not yet see where it led. I thought often about my son as a child, about how he used to follow me from room to room, asking questions that had no real answers, about the way he would fall asleep at the kitchen table while I paid bills late at night, his head resting against my arm. I remembered the pride in his eyes the first time he wore a suit, how he checked his reflection repeatedly, afraid and excited all at once. Somewhere between then and now, he had learned to measure worth differently. I wondered when I had stopped noticing. A week after the party, an envelope arrived in the mail with no return address. Inside were copies of documents I recognized immediately: bank statements, property records, papers I had signed years earlier without much thought, trusting that they were part of helping my son build the life he wanted. I sat at the table for a long time, spreading them out carefully, my fingers tracing signatures that looked unfamiliar now, even though they were mine. My husband watched quietly from across the room. He did not interrupt. He had known these papers existed. He had never asked what they contained. That night, I slept deeply for the first time in days, not because I felt relieved, but because something had settled into certainty. There was no longer a question of whether I had done something wrong. The shape of the truth was becoming clearer, and clarity, even when painful, brings its own kind of rest. The following week, I received an invitation, not to a party, to a meeting. It came from someone I had never met, written in careful language that suggested urgency without desperation. I read it twice before setting it down. My husband asked what it was. I told him it was time. He did not ask time for what, he simply nodded, as if he had been waiting for that word. On the morning of the meeting, I dressed with the same quiet attention I had given the night of the party. Nothing extravagant, nothing apologetic, just myself, as I had always been. Before leaving, I paused at the door, my hand resting on the handle. For a moment, I thought of my son standing in that crowded room, realizing that the narrative he had built so carefully was no longer entirely under his control. I did not feel satisfaction. I felt distance. As I stepped outside, I understood that whatever came next would not be about confrontation. It would be about standing where I had always stood, quietly, firmly, and letting the truth speak in its own time. And somewhere deep inside, beneath the weight of years, a steady resolve began to take hold, one that would not be easily shaken.
The office where the meeting was held was nothing like the places my son preferred. There were no glass walls, no polished floors that reflected your shoes back at you, no assistants offering bottled water with rehearsed smiles. It was a modest building, slightly set back from the street, the kind you could pass 100 times without noticing. Inside, the air smelled faintly of paper and old wood. I arrived 10 minutes early, as I always do. My husband waited in the car. This was something I needed to do alone. The woman who greeted me did not rush. She shook my hand firmly and led me into a small room with a round table and 2 chairs. There was no window. The lighting was soft, almost apologetic. She asked if I was comfortable. I told her I was. That was mostly true. Comfort is relative when you have already lived through worse things than this. She began speaking carefully, choosing her words as if each one carried weight. She explained who she was, what her role was, and why I had been contacted. I listened without interruption. Listening has always been one of my strengths. It was how I survived raising a child alone. It was how I learned to hear what was not being said.
As she spoke, pieces I had carried separately for years began to settle into place. Decisions my son had made on my behalf, accounts I had allowed him to manage, properties I had signed over, believing they were temporary arrangements, safeguards, necessities. I remembered the trust I had felt then, how natural it seemed to support him in every way possible. He was building something, after all. That was what I told myself. That was what mothers do. The woman slid a folder across the table. Inside were copies of transactions, timelines, names I recognized and others I did not. None of it was dramatic, no sudden revelations, just a slow, undeniable accumulation of facts. She did not accuse my son directly. She did not need to. The truth was laid out in quiet lines of ink. I felt no urge to defend him. That surprised me more than anything else. I had defended him all my life, even when he was wrong, especially when he was wrong. Sitting there, I realized how tired I was of that role. When the meeting ended, she asked if I had questions. I said no. I had questions, of course, but none that needed answers in that room. Some things are not meant to be resolved quickly. She told me she would be in touch. I thanked her and left. Outside, the afternoon had turned gray. Clouds hung low, threatening rain without quite committing to it. My husband was waiting where I had left him, leaning against the car, his jacket folded over his arm. He asked how it went. I told him it was clear. He nodded again, the same small nod he had given me days earlier. He did not press for details. He has never needed them. Trust for him is quiet. That evening, my son came to the house unannounced. I saw his car pull up from the kitchen window. My first instinct was to step back to let my husband handle it, but something in me stayed still. I wiped my hands on a towel and went to the door. When I opened it, Julian stood there looking as he always did in public, controlled, polished, but there was something beneath it this time, something restless and sharp. He did not greet my husband. He did not step inside. He asked me why I had done what I did. I told him I hadn't done anything. That answer unsettled him more than anger would have. He asked about the box. He asked who had helped me. He asked if I was trying to ruin him. His words came quickly, overlapping, as if he were afraid that if he stopped speaking, something worse would happen. I listened. When he finally paused, waiting for me to explain myself, I told him the truth. I said I had simply given him what was already his. He stared at me confused, and for a moment I saw the child he had been, the one who needed reassurance. Then his face hardened. He said I didn't understand how things worked. He said I was being manipulated. He said I was making a mistake. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice. I told him I understood more than he thought, that there were things I would not discuss at the door, that I needed time. He laughed at that, a short, humorless sound, and said time was not something he could afford. He told me I was choosing my husband over him. That accusation landed quietly, without impact. I had been choosing myself, though I had only just begun to realize it. He left without saying goodbye. The car drove away quickly, tires scraping slightly against the pavement. My husband closed the door and stood beside me. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then he asked if I was all right. I said I was learning to be. Over the next few weeks, my son's name appeared everywhere, not in celebration, but in whispers. Articles that raised questions without offering conclusions, conversations that ended abruptly when someone entered the room. He stopped calling. His lawyer did not. Letters arrived, formal and distant, asking for meetings, for clarifications, for cooperation. I read them all. I answered none. At night, I lay awake thinking about the gift box, about how small it was, how ordinary it looked among all the others. It had not contained anger. It had not contained revenge. It had contained truth, carefully preserved, waiting for the right moment to be seen. That thought brought me neither joy nor sorrow. It brought me resolve. One afternoon, as rain finally fell, steady and unapologetic, I received another message. This one was not cautious, it was not polite, it was frightened. I did not open it right away. I stood at the window, watching water gather and run down the glass. Somewhere inside, I knew that the silence I had chosen was beginning to speak for me, and that whatever came next would change things in ways none of us could fully control. The message stayed unopened until the next morning, not because I was afraid of it, but because I needed to remind myself that urgency belonged to other people now. I woke early, as I always do, and sat at the kitchen table while the house was still dim and quiet. My husband was asleep. I could hear his breathing through the thin wall, steady and untroubled. I made coffee and let it cool untouched while I stared at my phone. When I finally read the message, it was shorter than I expected. My son wanted to meet. Not at my house, not at his, somewhere neutral. He said there were misunderstandings. He said things had gone too far. He said we needed to talk before irreparable damage was done. I read the words several times. They were carefully chosen, familiar from years of watching him negotiate his way through problems. There was no mention of apology, no acknowledgement of the notice on the wall, of the public exclusion, of the quiet cruelty that had preceded everything else. Only concern for damage, and only when that damage had begun to touch him. I placed the phone face down and finished my coffee, now cold and bitter. When my husband came into the kitchen, I told him about the message. He listened without interruption, then asked what I wanted to do. That question, simple as it was, caught me off guard. For most of my life, I had answered questions about what was best, what was necessary, what was expected, rarely what I wanted. I told him I would meet Julian, not because he asked, but because there were things I needed to see with my own eyes. We agreed on a cafe halfway between our homes. It was a place I had been to once before, years ago, when Julian was just starting his career and insisted on paying for everything. I arrived first. The cafe was already busy, filled with low conversations and the clink of cups against saucers. I chose a table near the window. I wanted to see the street. I wanted to know when he arrived. Julian was 10 minutes late. He walked in quickly, scanning the room before his eyes landed on me. He smiled, the same practiced smile that at once made people trust him instantly. He sat down without asking how I was. He ordered coffee without looking at the menu. He leaned forward and spoke in a low voice, as if the walls themselves were listening. He said this had all gotten out of hand. He said people were asking questions. He said investors were nervous. He said my silence was being interpreted badly. I let him finish. When he stopped, he looked at me expectantly, waiting for reassurance, for correction, for the familiar rhythm where I smoothed things over. I did none of those things. I told him I had not spoken to anyone, that I had not answered questions because no one had asked me directly. That seemed to unsettle him. He asked about the documents. He asked where I had gotten them. I told him they were always mine. His jaw tightened. He said I didn't understand the implications. I said I understood them very well. For the first time since he sat down, he looked genuinely uncertain. He said I was being unreasonable. He reminded me of everything he had accomplished. He reminded me of how hard he had worked. He reminded me of the life he had given me before I married my husband, as if those years of isolation had been a gift. I listened the way I always had, but something had changed. His words no longer landed where they used to. They passed through me, familiar and ineffective. I asked him a question then. I asked him why he had been so determined to keep my husband out of his life. He hesitated. He said it was complicated. He said appearances mattered. He said people wouldn't understand. I asked him who people were. He did not answer. I asked him why humiliation had seemed necessary. That question landed differently. His eyes flicked toward the window. He said it had been a mistake. He said he hadn't meant for it to be taken that way. I told him intent mattered less than impact. He did not like that. The conversation ended without resolution. He stood abruptly, leaving money on the table, and told me we would talk again soon. He said lawyers would be in touch. He said I hoped I would come to my senses. I watched him walk out, his shoulders tight, his steps quick. When he was gone, I stayed where I was, finishing my tea slowly. Around me, the cafe continued as if nothing had happened. People laughed. Someone spilled sugar and brushed it away. Life remained uninterested in our private conflicts. In the weeks that followed, my son's presence receded, replaced by paperwork and intermediaries. Meetings were scheduled and postponed. Letters arrived with language so careful it felt brittle. I attended appointments quietly, answering questions when asked, providing information without embellishment. No one raised their voice. No one accused me of anything. That, more than anything, told me how serious it had become. One afternoon, I received a call from a woman whose voice trembled slightly as she spoke. She said she had lost money. She said she had trusted my son. She said she did not know who else to call. I listened. I told her I was sorry. I did not promise anything. After we hung up, I sat for a long time, staring at the wall. My son's actions were no longer abstract. They had faces now, voices. At home, my husband continued his routines, grounding us both. He fixed a loose hinge. He planted herbs in the small patch of soil by the fence. He never asked how far things would go. He never suggested stopping. His support was not loud. It was consistent. Late one night, unable to sleep, I opened the drawer where I kept old photographs. I found one of Julian as a boy standing beside me in our small living room, grinning proudly at something he had built from scraps. I remembered how I had praised him then, how I had told him he could do anything. I wondered if that had been the beginning of his misunderstanding, the place where encouragement had turned into entitlement. As I put the photograph away, my phone buzzed again. Another message, this one from someone I did not recognize. It contained only one sentence, written plainly, without greeting or signature. What you started cannot be undone. I did not know if it was a warning or a statement of fact. I only knew that whatever remained unspoken was drawing closer, and that the quiet endurance I had practiced for so long was about to be tested in ways I could no longer predict. The days after that message settled into a strange rhythm, neither calm nor chaotic, just suspended. I stopped checking my phone first thing in the morning. Instead, I listened to the house wake up, pipes shifting, birds arguing on the fence, my husband moving quietly as if sound itself were fragile. There was comfort in those small, predictable noises. They reminded me that not everything had been taken over by my son's choices. I did not respond to the message. I did not delete it either. Some words are better left where they are, untouched, allowed to exist without reaction. Silence, I was learning, could be more unsettling than confrontation. It gave people room to project their own fears. I let them. Letters continued to arrive, some formal, some almost pleading. I read each one carefully, noting what was said and what was avoided. No one asked me how I was. No one mentioned the notice at the entrance or the way my name had been quietly erased. Everything revolved around urgency, containment, minimizing damage, the language of preservation, not of accountability. I answered only what was required, nothing more. I signed where I needed to sign, I showed up when summoned, I spoke plainly, and then stopped. My husband watched all of this with a patience that never felt passive. He never offered strategies or advice. He never told me what he thought I should do. He made dinner. He drove when I was tired. He waited in parking lots with a book while I went into meetings that grew longer each time. When I came back out, he always asked the same question, "Are you all right?" Some days I said yes, some days I said not yet. Both answers were true.
At night, when sleep came unevenly, I thought about the years before any of this, about the way my life had narrowed so gradually I hadn't noticed it happening. After my husband died, my world had become smaller, quieter, centered almost entirely around my son, his needs, his ambitions, his future. I had told myself that was natural, that motherhood was meant to be consuming. Somewhere along the way, I had stopped asking where I fit once his life no longer required me. One evening, as we were clearing the dishes, my husband asked me a question he had not asked before. He asked what I was afraid of. The question surprised me. I considered it carefully. I told him I was afraid of becoming invisible. He nodded, as if he understood that fear intimately. He said quietly that I wasn't invisible to him. That was enough. The next week brought a meeting I could not avoid, a long table, too many chairs, faces that looked at me with curiosity more than judgment. I answered questions calmly. I corrected assumptions when necessary. I did not speculate. When someone tried to rush me, I asked them to slow down. When someone suggested outcomes, I said I was not there to predict the future. I was there to tell the truth. That seemed to unsettle them. When it was over, I stepped outside into air that felt heavier than it should have. Clouds pressed low against the city, thick and unmoving. My phone buzzed again. This time it was my son. I did not answer. A moment later, a message appeared. He said I was enjoying this. He said I had always resented his success. He said I was finally getting what I wanted. I read it once and then put the phone away. I had wanted very little from him, really. Respect, honesty, a place that did not feel conditional. If he could not see that now, he never had. That night, I took out the gift box. I had kept a second one, identical to the first, tucked away in the back of the closet. Inside, it was nothing dramatic, copies of documents, records, things that had existed for years without being acknowledged. I did not open it. I did not need to. Just knowing it was there reminded me that truth does not need embellishment. It only needs to be revealed at the right time. I began sorting through my own belongings then, slowly, methodically, papers first, then photographs, then objects that no longer felt like mine. Each item I touched carried a memory, but not all memories deserved to be carried forward. I gave some things away, others I threw out. The process was not sad, it was clarifying. I was making room, though I wasn't yet sure for what. One afternoon, while my husband was at work, I received a call from a number I didn't recognize. I answered out of habit. The voice on the other end was careful, professional. They said developments were moving faster than expected. They said my cooperation had made certain things unavoidable. They said there would be consequences. I thanked them for informing me. When I hung up, my hands were steady. As evening approached, I sat on the back step and watched the light fade from the yard. The herbs my husband had planted were growing well, small green leaves reaching upward without hesitation. Growth, I realized, did not ask for permission. It happened when conditions allowed it. I wondered if the same was finally true for me. When my husband came home, he found me there and sat beside me without speaking. We watched the sky darken together. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed briefly and then stopped. The world continued its uneven movement forward. I knew then that whatever my son was facing could no longer be softened by my presence, and as that realization settled in, quiet and irreversible, I understood that the most difficult part was still ahead, waiting just beyond the edge of what I was ready to name.
The waiting changed shape after that. It was no longer anxious, no longer filled with second-guessing. It became deliberate. I stopped arranging my days around what might happen and began arranging them around what already was. Mornings started with simple routines. I watered the plants. I folded laundry while listening to the radio at a low volume. I walked around the block at the same time every afternoon, nodding to neighbors who had known me for years without ever really seeing me. There was steadiness in repetition, and steadiness felt like strength. The world around my son grew louder. His name appeared more often, and not in the places he preferred. Articles were careful at first, asking questions without conclusions, presenting concerns as curiosities. Then the language shifted. Words like review, audit, and irregularities began to surface. I did not read everything. I did not need to. What mattered was not the volume of the noise, but the direction it was moving, and it was moving on its own now. People began to call less frequently. When they did, their voices carried a different tone, no longer assuming my alignment with my son. Some spoke to me as if I were a witness, others as if I were a footnote. A few, unexpectedly, spoke to me as if I were someone who had endured something quietly and come out the other side. Those conversations were brief but meaningful. They did not ask for details. They thanked me for my restraint. I accepted that gratitude without comment. My son did not come to the house again. Instead, messages arrived through intermediaries, each one more strained than the last. He wanted to clarify. He wanted to negotiate. He wanted to understand my intentions. The language had shifted subtly from accusation to concern, from authority to appeal. I recognized the pattern. It was the same one he used as a teenager when he realized punishment was unavoidable. He had always been quick to adapt when control slipped. That talent had served him well for years. It would not save him now. One afternoon, a woman knocked on the door. She introduced herself politely, her posture careful, her eyes tired. She said she had invested more than she could afford to lose. She said she had believed in my son because everyone else had. She said she did not know what she expected from me, only that she needed to say something to someone who might listen. I invited her inside. We sat at the kitchen table, and she spoke while her hands trembled slightly around her cup. I did not promise her anything. I did not explain anything. I listened. When she left, she thanked me for my time. I realized then how rare simple listening had become in a world built on persuasion. That evening, my husband asked if I was tired. I told him I was, but not in the way I used to be. This tiredness felt earned. It felt like the end of something rather than the beginning. He smiled at that, faintly, and went back to sanding a piece of wood he had been working on for days. Watching him, I thought about how different kinds of labor leave different marks. Some leave calluses, others leave absences. I began preparing quietly, not for confrontation, but for continuity. I updated records, I organized files, I labeled folders in a way that made sense to me, not to anyone else. I made lists, then revised them, then folded them away. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would look like a plan if someone stumbled across it, just readiness, just the assurance that when I was asked a question, I would not have to search for the answer. Sleep came more easily then. When I woke at night, it was not with my heart racing, but with thoughts settling themselves into place. I thought about my life beyond my son, a concept that once felt disloyal and now felt necessary. I thought about the years I had spent making myself smaller so he could feel larger. I did not regret loving him. I regretted confusing love with surrender. The call came on a Wednesday afternoon. I was in the garden, kneeling in the dirt, when my phone rang. I wiped my hands on my jeans before answering. The voice on the other end was calm, professional, and final in a way that did not invite questions. They told me there would be formal proceedings. They told me I might be contacted again. They told me my presence would be required at a later date. I thanked them and ended the call. The earth under my knees felt solid. That mattered. When my husband came home, I told him what I had been told. He listened, then asked if I wanted to sit outside. We did. The evening was mild, the air heavy with the scent of soil and leaves. He reached for my hand and held it without squeezing. I thought about how rarely I had allowed myself to be held without feeling like I owed something in return. My son called that night. I let it ring. He left a message. His voice sounded thinner, less certain. He said he needed me. He said he was running out of options. He said we were family, and family stood together. I listened to the message once and deleted it. Family, I had learned, was not a word you used when you wanted something. It was a way of behaving when nothing was being asked. In the days that followed, the pressure intensified, but it no longer reached me in the same way. I felt insulated, not by denial, but by acceptance. The outcome was no longer mine to control. My role was simply to remain where I was, steady and present, answering when spoken to, silent when not. One evening, as I was closing the curtains, I noticed a car parked across the street longer than necessary. It idled, then drove away slowly. I did not know if it was connected to anything or nothing at all. I did not investigate. I turned off the light and sat beside my husband. Whatever was approaching no longer felt like a threat. It felt an arrival. And as that awareness settled in, quiet and unmistakable, I understood that the moment of exposure I had avoided naming was now close enough to feel, hovering just beyond the ordinary sounds of our small, intact life.
The day everything became official did not arrive with drama. There were no raised voices, no flashing lights, no sudden confrontations at the door. It came in the form of a scheduled appointment written in neat black ink on a white envelope, a date, a time, a location that sounded ordinary enough to belong to any other life. I placed the envelope on the table and went on with my morning. I made breakfast. I watered the plants. I folded the same towel twice without realizing it. By the time my husband came home to drive me, my hands were steady. The building we entered was taller than the one before, cleaner, more anonymous. Inside, everything echoed slightly, footsteps softened by carpet, voices kept low. We were directed to a waiting room where chairs were arranged in careful rows. I sat down and placed my purse at my feet. My husband sat beside me. He did not speak. He did not need to. His presence was enough to remind me where I belonged. When my name was called, I went in alone. The room held several people, all seated, all already aware of more than I was about to say. A woman nodded at me kindly. A man adjusted his glasses. Papers were arranged. Screens glowed faintly. No one looked surprised to see me. That, I realized, was important. Whatever had happened at my son's party had only been the beginning. The real story had been unfolding quietly for much longer. I was asked to confirm my identity. I did. I was asked to confirm relationships. I did. Then I was asked about accounts, properties, trusts, transfers that had occurred over a span of years. I answered each question carefully, slowly, truthfully. When I did not know something, I said so. When I did, I stated it plainly. There was no need to embellish. The facts stood well enough on their own. At one point, a document was turned toward me. It bore my signature, dated years earlier. I recognized it immediately. At the time, I had been told it was temporary, a formality, a way to streamline things. I said as much. The woman nodded and made a note. Another document followed, then another. Patterns emerged, timelines aligned. I felt no shock, only confirmation. They asked me about the gift box. I explained calmly that it had contained copies of records already in existence, nothing altered, nothing added, that it had been placed where it would eventually be seen. that I had not announced it, I had not explained it, I had simply allowed it to speak for itself. There was a pause after I finished, not discomfort, consideration. One of them asked me if my intention had been to expose my son publicly. I thought about that carefully before answering. I said no. My intention had been to stop protecting him privately. The distinction mattered. I could see it land differently than accusation ever would. When the meeting ended, I was told what would happen next, not in detail, not with predictions, only the outline of a process already in motion, investigations that had crossed thresholds, accounts that had been frozen, properties under review. I was told that my cooperation had clarified things, that the information I had provided matched what had already been discovered, that I might be called again, but that for now my role was complete. I thanked them and stood to leave. Outside, the air felt sharper, as if the city had shifted slightly while I was inside. My husband was waiting where he said he would be. When he saw my face, he did not ask questions. He opened the car door. We drove home in silence, the kind that does not demand explanation. The call came later that evening. This time it was not my son, it was his attorney. His voice was controlled but tight, as if effort were required to maintain that control. He said circumstances had changed. He said certain assumptions were no longer valid. He said my son was unavailable to speak at that moment. I did not ask why. I already knew. He asked if I would be willing to delay any further statements. I told him I had already said everything I needed to say. He paused, then thanked me for my time. The line went dead. An hour later, my son called. I almost did not answer, not out of fear, but out of certainty. I knew what his voice would sound like. I knew what words he would choose. I answered anyway. He did not greet me. He asked me what I had done. I told him I had told the truth. There was a long silence on the line. Then his voice broke in a way I had never heard before. Not anger, not confidence, fear. He said things were being taken from him. He said accounts were locked. He said people he trusted were not returning his calls. He said this had gone too far. He said I could still help him fix it. I listened without interruption. When he finished, I spoke carefully. I told him I could not fix something I did not break. I told him that what was happening now was not something I controlled. I told him that the protection I had offered him for years had not saved him, it had delayed him, and delay, I said, is not the same as mercy. He asked me if this was revenge. I said no. He asked me why I hadn't warned him. I said I had been warning him his entire life, just not in words he wanted to hear. There was another silence, heavier than the first. Then he said my name the way he had when he was a child, stretched thin with need. For a moment, I almost answered the way I used to. Almost. Instead, I told him I hoped he would face what came next honestly. I told him that running from it would only make it worse. I told him that whatever remained between us would have to wait until he could stand without lies beneath his feet. He did not respond. The call ended. That night, I sat at the kitchen table long after my husband had gone to bed. I did not feel victorious. I did not feel cruel. I felt emptied in a way that made room for something else, relief perhaps, or simply space. Somewhere across the city, doors were closing for my son, not at once, not loudly, one by one, and for the first time, I did not reach out to hold any of them open. The days that followed were quieter than I expected. Not peaceful exactly, but subdued, as if the world had lowered its voice out of respect for what had been said. My son's name continued to surface in the news, though no one called me about it anymore. The story had become larger than our relationship, larger than my silence or my presence. It belonged to processes and timelines now, to rooms I would never enter, to decisions made without sentiment. That distance felt strange at first, like a limb gone numb, but slowly it settled into something steadier. I was asked to attend one more meeting. This one was brief, clarifying rather than probing. I answered the questions they asked and nothing beyond them.
When it was over, they thanked me for my cooperation and told me I would not be required again unless something unexpected arose. The word unexpected lingered with me as I left the building, though I knew there was little left that could surprise me. At home, life rearranged itself quietly. My husband and I fell into rhythms that felt newly intentional. We ate dinner earlier, we took longer walks, we talked about ordinary things. The weather, a crack in the sidewalk that had grown wider since spring, a neighbor's dog that barked too much and then stopped. These conversations were not distractions, they were anchors. They reminded me that the center of my life no longer revolved around anticipation or repair. My son did not call again. At first, I waited without meaning to. I would notice my phone on the table and feel a faint tightening, a habit I had not yet unlearned. But days passed, then weeks, and the space where his voice had once intruded began to feel less like absence and more like relief. I stopped wondering what he was thinking. I stopped imagining explanations. I let the unanswered questions remain unanswered. One afternoon, I found myself standing in the doorway of the room I had once kept for him, the room that had stayed largely untouched long after he moved out. I had avoided it for years, telling myself it was a sign of respect, of faith. That afternoon, I stepped inside and opened the windows. Light filled the space, dust rising and settling again. I went through the drawers slowly, choosing what to keep and what to let go. There were school notebooks, old letters, trophies whose meaning had long since faded. I kept a few things. I gave the rest away. As I worked, I did not feel sadness. I felt release. People began to treat me differently, not with pity, but with a careful acknowledgement, as if they understood something had shifted. Some asked gentle questions, others said nothing at all. I learned to accept both. There was no need to explain myself anymore. The truth had already done its work. One evening, my husband asked me if I wanted to travel somewhere once everything settled. Not far, just away. The idea surprised me. For years, the thought of leaving, even briefly, had filled me with anxiety. Now it felt possible. I told him we could think about it. That was enough. Late one night, I received a message from an unfamiliar number. It was short. It said my son had been moved. No details, no explanation. I read it once and set the phone down. I did not respond. Whatever separation had begun was no longer symbolic. It was real, physical, and final in ways I did not need to witness to accept. I sat on the edge of the bed, listening to my husband's steady breathing, and allowed myself to feel something I had avoided naming. Grief, yes, but also clarity. The two were not opposites. They existed together, each giving shape to the other. Loving someone did not require remaining entangled in the wreckage they left behind. In the morning, I woke with the sense that a chapter had closed without ceremony. No farewell, no confrontation, just an ending that arrived quietly, the way so many important things do. I stood at the window and watched the street come to life, people heading to places that mattered to them. I realized that my own path no longer required constant defense. It was open, unguarded, and finally my own. That understanding brought a calm I had not known before, not happiness in the way it is advertised, but steadiness, enoughness. I knew then that whatever came next would not involve my son asking me to fix what he had broken, and that knowledge, heavy as it once would have been, now felt like a boundary I could live within. As I turned away from the window, I sensed the story drawing toward an end, not with resolution, but with distance. The kind of distance that allows breath to return, the kind that lets a life resume its quiet, deliberate movement forward, unburdened by the need to be understood. The morning I went to see Julian, the sky was pale and undecided, neither bright nor dark, as if it too was unsure of what should come next. I woke before the alarm and lay still beside Jack, listening to his breathing. He didn't ask if I was nervous. He didn't tell me everything would be fine. He simply reached for my hand and held it until it was time to get up. That was how our life had become. Quiet understanding,
no speeches, no promises. The drive to the prison took nearly 2 hours, long stretches of road with nothing but dry fields and low buildings, the kind of landscape that gives you too much time to think. I replayed nothing on purpose, yet memories surfaced anyway. Julian as a child, asleep in the back seat after school, Julian as a teenager, staring out the window, already drifting away from me. Julian as the man he became, polished and distant, standing in a ballroom where I was not welcome. I did not cry. I felt emptied of tears, as if they had already done their work. The prison itself was gray and severe, built without any interest in comfort. I parked, locked the car, and sat for a moment before getting out. My hands were steady. That surprised me. Inside, there were rules, procedures, forms. My purse was searched. I walked through metal detectors. Each step stripped something from me until I felt reduced to just a woman moving forward because she had decided to. A guard led me to a visiting room with bolted-down tables and hard chairs. The room smelled faintly of disinfectant and something older, something tired. And then Julian was brought in. For a second, I didn't recognize him. He had lost weight, not the careful kind that comes with trainers and diets, but the hollow kind. His shoulders were narrower, his hair was cut short, uneven in places, but confidence he used to carry like armor was gone. He wore an orange uniform that hung loosely on his frame. When he looked up and saw me, his face changed in a way I had never seen before. Not anger, not embarrassment, something softer, something like fear. We sat across from each other, a metal table between us, heavier than it looked. For a long time, neither of us spoke. I studied his hands resting on the table. No rings, no watch. The hands that once signed contracts and held champagne flutes now showed roughness at the knuckles, small marks from work that didn't ask who he used to be. "Thank you for coming," he said finally. His voice was lower than I remembered, stripped of performance. "I'm here," I replied. It was the most honest thing I could offer. He nodded, as if bracing himself. "I didn't think you would," he admitted. "I wouldn't have blamed you if you didn't." I waited. Silence had become my strength. Julian took a breath. "He've had a lot of time," he said slowly. "Time to think about everything. About the party, about the sign, about the way I treated you." His eyes stayed on the table. "That photograph on the door," he continued, his voice tightening. "I see it every night. I see your face in that picture, smiling, trusting me. And I ask myself how I could have done that, how I could have humiliated my own mother in front of strangers." Something inside me shifted, not breaking, but settling. For a long time, I told myself you deserved it, that you embarrassed me, that you chose the wrong man, that you were trying to ruin my image. He looked up then, his eyes red but steady. But the truth is, I was ashamed of myself, and I turned that shame into cruelty. I felt the tears then, rising quietly. I did not wipe them away. "I don't expect forgiveness," Julian said quickly, as if afraid of silence. "I know I don't deserve it, but I needed you to know that I understand now what you did, why you did it. You didn't expose me to hurt me. You exposed me because it was right, because people were being harmed, because you still believed I could be better." He swallowed hard. "I didn't see that before. I only saw myself." I reached out then, slowly, placing my hand on the table. After a moment's hesitation, he placed his hand over mine. His fingers trembled. They were cold. "I love you," he said, his voice breaking. "I always have, even when I acted like I didn't." I took a breath before answering. "I love you too," I said. "That never stopped. But love doesn't mean protecting you from consequences. It means wanting you to become someone who can live with himself." He nodded, tears finally falling.
"I want that," he said. "I have 17 years to work on it, and I will." When the guard announced the end of visiting time, we didn't rush. We stood awkwardly, unsure of how to say goodbye. There was no embrace, just a shared look, heavy and honest. "Will you come back?" he asked quietly. "Not yet," I said. "I need time, but someday, yes." The drive home felt different, lighter, not because everything was fixed, but because nothing was pretending anymore. When I arrived, Jack was waiting at the door. He didn't ask questions. He opened his arms and I stepped into them. That night, I sat in our small garden and looked up at the stars. They were steady, indifferent, beautiful. I felt tired but at peace, not because my son had fallen, but because I had finally let go of the burden of holding him up. And in that release, I found myself standing taller than I had in years.